everyone, Ariel Adams here with Superlative Podcast. Please listen to our other aBlogtoWatch podcast, aBlogtoWatch Weekly, where we cover the latest news and reviews. Today in Superlative, my guest is Tony Traina. He is the founder of the newsletter Unpolished. Tony, welcome.
Ariel, thanks for having me. I have to say, I used to host the podcast for Hodinkee for most of 2024, but it's a lot of fun to just show up as a guest. I don't have to do any prep. I just show up and look handsome, which you do a good job of as well.
It's easier, right? When someone else is taking control of the reins and you're just show me where this carriage is going.
That's right. All this to say, thank you.
How did you like being a podcast host?
I enjoyed it. It's funny. When I had conceived it kind of at the beginning of 2024 as bringing it back, I didn't think I would have a ton of guests. We kind of thought of it as a panel thing where we would bring on Hodinkee editors just every week to talk about the news of the week. But very quickly, I found that it was difficult to just have fresh content and fresh takes every week like that. And it turned into a guest show pretty quickly. And we would have guests pretty much every week or 4 out of 5 weeks. And I enjoyed that part of it, thinking about having a variety of guests, the type of thing you do, right? I was just listening to your episode with Matt Zinsky, who I'm a big fan of. But having a variety of guests on to keep things fresh and new perspectives and all of that was something I found enjoyable.
It's funny because from an outward perspective, podcasts and watch collecting don't go together super neatly because you're visual hobby about stuff, people talking without necessarily visuals. Obviously we do video now, but it's what we call talking heads. How would you explain to a third party or maybe somebody newer to this industry, maybe even a marketing or collecting side, why podcasts have been, we'll call it popular in such a visual space?
I think that, it's the same reason people like to get together to talk watches. I think it's able to capture some of that, two folks at a bar, talking about watches. You're there, you like to see the watches, get hands-on and all of that type of stuff, right. But you like to hear people talking about things, what they're thinking about buying, what they think about the latest Patek, Rolex, whatever it is. And I think it captures that in a really nice way that no other medium really can. It's free flowing. We're going to have a conversation for an hour. It's just the best medium for capturing that. And I think it's the same reason it works in, sports, entertainment, everything else, right? And watches are like a crazy hobby. So it seems to work pretty well,
I remember back in 2010 when I started doing the first watch podcasting, there was no others at all. The one that I did with John Biggs was the very first one. And it was surprisingly popular, but it was a comedy show, what we did to start with. People don't really remember that. We basically made fun of the dumb product names, some of the dumb marketing materials, to some of the silliness. We used to completely tear apart certain designs for an entire episode. And it was only later on did I think podcasting about watches get a little bit more serious about the hobby as opposed to laughing about the silliness that can come through all the, call it cultural mistranslations.
Are there, not to put you on the spot, but are there any really terrible names from 15 years ago that you remember or that just really stand out to you as things you really cracked on?
One episode that I don't remember how this watch came on our radar, if I was the one that pointed out or someone else, but we found this watch called the Bull Toro. And that was the name of the brand. Maybe that was the name of the model. And we just couldn't stop laughing about the person that came up with this, who was the audience, and honestly, in the last, over 15 years now, there's been a lot more silly names that have come out. But I think what amused us is that there could be not just a brand name, but an entire product and ethos around a company that your average Westerner would just laugh at. And I think that's what's interesting about the watch industry is that, especially today, it's not like you're selling, fun swatches for everyone. It's all really expensive. And there's sort of this air of seriousness around expensive. So sort of that merger between weird, quirky stuff that shouldn't cost a lot and the stuff that does cost a lot that I think was the most amusing back then. And I think it's only gotten weirder now, but since I have more deep relationships, it's harder to make fun of it as much as possible, because then I'll have to go to France and they'll be like, you just made fun of my marketing. I'm like, I'm really sorry, sir.
Yeah, right. I wasn't around in 2010. I was in college or whatever, but the industry, even at the time I've been doing it full time or part time, it's grown so much, and the blogs and podcasts have all gotten professionalized and commercialized as well. It's just changed. It's a real business now, you know? Thanks to people like you, Ariel.
A lot has changed. I think one of the things that has changed dramatically, and I think about this a lot, is when you got into the hobby, it was already a social hobby. When I got in the hobby, it was a solo hobby. I learned about watches alone. I didn't have people to discuss it with. I didn't have other people's opinions to hear at all. All the watch media at the time when I was getting into this in the early 2000s was completely neutral. You'd pick up Watch Time magazine, which was probably the most popular one in the United States. And again, I don't know everything they do today, but there was no opinion. It was like, here's a bunch of information, zero opinion of any kind. Everything is great. Everything is amazing, but no opinion. So you had to form your own opinion in a sea of just positivity. Nowadays, it couldn't be more different. I mean, it could not be more different. You have every kind of opinion out there about every kind of thing, extreme highs, extreme lows, and it's a social first hobby where there's other people to meet right away. Like, you meet watch lovers today, I think, before a lot of people decide what watches they even like. And that was completely foreign to how I got into it. There was never anyone to talk about watches with. I had to like things first and foremost, and then maybe, if I was lucky, find somebody that wanted to talk about it with me.
It's very true. When I got into watches towards the end of law school, basically. I went to law school here in Chicago. And one of the first things I did was figure out, I had discovered the forums and the blogs, but you want to do this stuff in person, right? I was just talking about it. And one of the first things I did was search for watch groups in Chicago, and you stumble on Red Bar, and maybe there were one or two others kind of floating around in the ether at that time. And then you go to those meetings eventually, and your taste gets formed very early on with the people whose watches you see and the stuff that they're into. And it is something I think about a lot, like what is kind of your own taste versus what's been formed by the people around you, the media around you, and all that type of stuff. And the reality is you probably can't decouple the two, which is part of the fun of it. But yeah, you're right. I mean, and part of the reason I like the hobby now is how social it is. But it's changed entirely, and I think that has probably brought. I mean, it's a net good, right? But it does come with like all kinds of consequences as well.
So when I was in law school, I was that guy who was known for looking at watches on eBay during class, because when I was in college, it was still before anyone had laptops. So I was writing notes. And by the time I got to law school, it was when people were taking all their notes on the computer. We had internet access, and I'm just not able to pay attention. So I would sit in the front. I was always the guy that sat in the front. So everyone was behind me. So they all saw my screen all the time. And I was just the guy that was searching for watches on eBay all day. Nobody was into watches. I had a buddy with an overseas. But other than that, there was like no one there that cared at all. So it wasn't until years later that I had any social circle there, even though I did my best, right? I projected it loud and proud. I'm into watches. If anyone else likes it, come chat with me. But there was no opinions to get. It did not exist. I had to be like, well, I'm just going to throw my opinions out there. And then all these other people, especially early on, I think was really nice, is you almost felt like, someone else was like, oh my God, I'm not the only one with this weird addiction. My friends and my family made me feel weird and awkward because I like watches. Finally, there's someone else out there with this compulsion. And nowadays, you see the compulsion before you understand what it is they're obsessed with. And again, I'm musing on it right now because I'm asking myself, what's the difference in terms of the buying habits, the taste, whatever, between someone who forms the desire for watches independently without influence and those who today are, as you said, creating desire based upon seeing other guys' opinion, what's on their wrist, et cetera. It's an interesting question, right?
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's kind of the question, right? I do think people are so aware. People have become so much more aware of the fact that they are influenced all the time. I mean, not only influencers, but just pure paid advertising, whatever it is. Like, everyone is trying to influence you to do this, do that, buy this, whatever it is. I think people are increasingly aware of it and starting to think more critically about like what it means for them and how they spend money and what they're putting on their wrist in this case and what they're expressing about themselves. I think people are starting to think more critically about trying to express themselves through watches and not just like what the algorithm feeds you, right? We saw that a few years ago, but I think it's kind of expanded in the past couple of years, what people are buying, how they're expressing themselves with the watches they buy and all of that. But it's
was there a trigger? Was there something that made people realize, like, wait a minute, I'm going about the wrong way?
I mean, it's probably a bigger societal question than just watches, right? I think just the exhaustion that all of us feel, right, all of the time, being on social media and all that type of stuff, and the feeling that we need to pull back from it. I know I feel this like more broadly than watches, like get off your damn phone, Tony, type of thing. And I know for a lot of people that's watches, and watches can be a really fun hobby, but it's also an addictive hobby, and it can be like it's an expensive one as well. So it can be dangerous. And like, if we're really focusing just on the consumption of it all, it's not good and it's not healthy. And I think we realized that in 2022, probably, when a lot of these things started to really slow down and a lot of the speculators and all of them kind of retreated from the hobby. I think that kind of was a bit of a reckoning, not only on the market side of things, but also in the how are people consuming type of things. I think we still have a ways to go, but I think that's probably some of it. I don't know. What do you think?
Do you think it had anything to do with pricing and how expensive things got?
Probably. I think this is part of the broader luxury conversation, right? Like, things have gotten so crazy the past couple of years, and people are just more aware of the fact that in some cases they're kind of being sold a bill of goods. And these brands over the past couple of years, when demand was hot, felt that they could just raise prices because it was there and the demand was there. And now it's not. And we kind of, as consumers, for all the reasons we talked about, there's so much information out there. We're just so aware of the fact that if someone releases a new watch, but there's Vacheron releases a new 222, it's really nice, but immediately there are complaints about no micro adjust. It's the same movements that's been in there for 20 or 30 years, whatever it is, right? It's a beautiful watch. I've seen it in person. It wears really nicely, but immediately there are some of those claims, even on a watch that's that nice, right? So I think there's just so much awareness as well.
I see an interesting trend that is still evolving related to this, which goes deeper than just prices being high, but a real class stratification. I'm starting to see watch brands who quite thoroughly do not want to be affordable by anyone but an upper class. And their value proposition is not better finishing, better materials, better movements. It's people who aren't rich can't afford us. So if you see one of these out there, that's a signal that the person wearing it has a certain requisite level of disposable income as a way of sort of asserting yourself. And it's quite different than, you wear like a blingy watch with diamonds. That's a I made it watch. That's a statement to a lower socioeconomic demographic that you just exited, that you just were part of. Hey, I'm out of your level now. I'm at a higher one. But when you wear like maybe more of an under the radar expensive watch, that's more noticed, less by a lower socioeconomic status, but a higher one, and it's sort of group inclusion. It's not that you made it, but you're part of our wealthy group. And that type of social identity cues are extremely important for a lot of people. It's not very classy to talk about it, but there's, I think, a lot of desire at certain brands to simply say to their clients, people associate us with those who have money and who are comfortable with the money. And yes, maybe you can get more watch for it, but you can't get our brand for it. And I think a lot of brands, Patek, Audemars Piguet, have really fallen into this idea that we're not trying to say this watch costs this amount. That's what it required for us to develop and make it. They're basically saying this is an exclusionary cost. But then that opens up a giant market for everyone else who wants a good watch, but isn't necessarily trying to say to someone, there's no way you could afford this because you're not rich like me. People don't really talk about that, I know, but I think that that's a huge divide between certain types of models out there. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's kind of those Thierry Stern comments, which I know you've covered, when the Cubitist came out. It's kind of saying that quiet part out loud that you're not really supposed to hear from a brand CEO that's trying to be at that ultra luxury tier. I think there's like kind of a traditional breakdown of like the 4 tiers of luxury or whatever it is. And you're kind of not supposed to say that if you're the CEO of one of these brands that's really trying to be at that level. But it's something you see. I mean, even if you look at these, the Swiss export numbers that the Horology Foundation puts out every quarter or every year. One of my favorite,
the only numbers they put out each year?
The only numbers they put out each year that give us any idea of what in the world might be happening in Switzerland. The one I like to quote, quite often is how volumes have essentially halved since the Apple Watch came out in 2015, from 15 million, I think nowadays, or a little bit less last year, from about 30 million. And the other thing you see is just the price premiumization of every single brand moving up market. Rolex, Grand Seiko, every single brand has done this on some level. And at one point, luxury wanted to reach the accessible consumer, you and me, to put it quite bluntly. Like, people that if they did well in life, they might aspire to a nice watch, a nice handbag, whatever else it is. And a lot of the times a lot of these brands have moved away from that model. We see it in jewelry, we see it in watches. Every year, right? We see Rolex releases a bunch of fancy diamond studded watches as well that they kind of low key release at Watches and Wonders, right? These are for the VVVIPs, right? They're not for the lawyer who aspires to do well in life, What I also think is interesting is how that thing that we're talking about is also like a black hole, and things get sucked into it. And I know vintage is a big thing in your world, and I think vintage is really being a victim to that. The reason why people are into vintage for the most part when I got started was that you can get a really cool watch for not a lot of money. You'd get oftentimes brands that still existed, but you'd go out and find an older piece for next to nothing, maybe spend a little bit of money to fix it up, and boom, you had a Vacheron, a Girard-Perregaux, an Audemars Piguet, a Rolex, whatever, and you didn't need to spend the money. So the vintage audience was actually someone who was information rich, maybe not as much with money, but had the time and desire to go out and hunt for that. It later evolved into, oh, no. You're actually more expensive than new now, right? You're a treasure, right? Like, and all these crazy valuations because certain types of performance artists, many of them run auctions, were telling stories about how, this is the next awesome thing for you wealthy folks to spend money on. You're bored, buying stuff. And that whole market became quite a major perversion of what it was. And then now you have this sort of cat and mouse game, in the market where certain collectors want to find those older watches that are not valuable, right? Because nobody wants them. And then everyone who's the dealer is like, oh, what's unvaluable? What can I mark up? What can I say is the next big thing? And then the collector's like, oh, darn, that's been ruined. I got to go find something else now. Yep. And it's just interesting how, again, the origin of people being into vintage watches had nothing to do with showing even more elitism. It was the complete opposite, right? Yeah, it's kind of like the media thing we were talking about a little bit. It's been professionalized in a way at the auction houses. There's an entire dealer class now. A lot of them former collectors that are now dealers and that have made a nice living selling watches, selling vintage watches in particular. There's the storytelling aspect and all of that, either on the micro level of a watch that has provenance, or look at what vintage Rolex used to be. I buy a lot of those stories, to be honest. Look, you kind of have to buy stories at some point, right? I mean, this is kind of the fundamental nature of the human race.
Hey, I like fantasy books too.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't think it's so different from modern brands are mostly storytelling as well. I don't think it's a whole lot different than what a lot of the modern brands are doing. And it's easy to get ripped off in the vintage watch world, being sold a bill of goods or a story that's not quite true. But it happens in the modern world too, I think. I don't know. I enjoy the treasure hunting aspect of vintage watches. The fact that everyone is a little different and all of these things that you can kind of roll your eyes at as well. It's just like a different frame it's a different way to view like the same set of facts,
I think it was more attractive to me when there weren't the speculators trying to increase the prices, because what I realized is much of the time, the exact same vintage watch now costs a lot more. And the only people that are making more money is the person selling it, right? The person who originally had it, they were happy with it. And so I think that's what, I don't want to say ruined it, but made someone like me very skeptical, is that all those awesome elements, the treasure hunting, the stories, sort of became second to trying to speculate on pricing and trying to see, is there someone out there willing to pay way more than this is worth? And I just don't like playing that game. It's just kind of annoying to me. There's always going to be someone out there with more money than me and less sense, right? So why try to compete with products for them?
Yeah, interesting. That's interesting sort of perception to have, I guess. I guess I just don't have quite the same perception. Maybe I'm just naive, right? Yeah, maybe I'm a little naive. I still open eBay every day and, like to scroll through and see things I've never seen before. And, a lot of them are still on. Like, a lot of these are crappy vintage watches that are worth $1,000 now. They were worth $1,000 5 years ago, and they're going to be worth the same in another 5 years. Like vintage Movados and Mitos and Seikos and all these types of things. Like, I think they're a lot of fun. Even the bigger ones like Breitling and Universal Geneve's a whole different thing. But some of these things, I think that the top end, right? I think there's a lot of speculation, let's say. But the kind of run-of-the-mill watches, like, there's still a lot out there that you can just have fun with. And it is what it is. You can buy it off of eBay or even off of some small-time dealer, and, you keep it for a year or two, you lose $100, gain $100. And, like, that's part of the fun. I think there's still a lot of, like, meat and potatoes vintage watches, let's call it that I still have quite a bit of fun with.
Don't get me wrong. I mean, I have a lot of vintage watches. I've bought a number. I think what initially persuaded me that modern watches were more interesting was the fact that, on comparison, they're usually better manufactured, more durable, oftentimes will be more reliable because they're just newer. And as someone that likes to wear my watches, I quickly identified that, like, a lot of vintage watches, as cool and pretty as they are not really safe to wear. And I'm wondering, when you go to the sort of vintage watch meetups, I haven't been to too many of them, is that discussed? Are they like, oh my God, and it's the new watch I have to worry about? Or is there sort of an apologetic way of accepting the fact that you need to baby these things, you have to constantly fix them, in a lot of similar ways as to people that are into old sports cars, which are fragile and constantly break, and you're like, oh my God, I wish I was driving a Honda right now.
Yeah, I think, it is funny. Sometimes you go to these vintage meetups and you ask the guy what they actually wear every day. And they're like, oh, I wear, my Black Bay 58 or my modern 6-digit sub or whatever it might be, whatever modern watch it is that may or may not even approximate the vintage experience. I mean, people love the Black Bay 54 for that reason, right? I think there even are tiers. Like, if you talk to people sometimes, if you're maintaining the gaskets and the water resistance and all of that type of stuff, usually if you can get it to, 50 bars of water resistance or something, that's more than enough for average living in 2025, right? But there are some watches that, fragile gilt dial Rolexes or fragile Cartiers that are going on 100 years old, right? There's a recognition that those are not going out of the garage as much, to use your car analogy. But a lot of the appeal of, I think, vintage Rolex, right, is a lot of the market still nowadays, is that if you get a random, matte dial Submariner from the 70s, you can tune that thing up to where it's relatively wearable nowadays, in my opinion. I mean, I have a vintage Explorer I wear quite a bit. I'm pretty comfortable with the water resistance. I've had watchmakers tested, and I know the gaskets are good and all of that. And I'll wear it biking around Chicago, which is probably not the smartest thing in the world, especially around this time of year when there's potholes everywhere. But it's not something I worry about a ton.
Is it because you think there's always another vintage watch out there? Because I think a lot of the times, if it's a true treasure that's unreplaceable, I think people are gonna, what they call it, the safe queen. It just sort of never leaves the house.
Yeah. I mean, some people feel like their watches are replaceable, but the reality is vintage Rolex is probably replaceable. A lot of vintage Cartiers. There are some that are truly quote unquote irreplaceable, but I'm not playing in that world.
Why is it that people don't seem to like modern and vintage equally? I meet very few people that oh yeah, I have an equal number of both. I wear them both. It seems to be that people gravitate towards one end of the spectrum more or another. And I haven't quite always understood that. What are your thoughts on that?
I feel as though that's it's collapsed a little bit, I think, in the time I've been observing. Like, I went to a vintage meetup just a couple of weeks ago down in Indianapolis with a bunch of folks who focus on vintage Rolex primarily. But it's always interesting to see. I mean, I mentioned, right, that they all have the modern watches that they wear, but especially kind of some of these more indies. I say indies, that, like capital I and lowercase I, right? Like $1,000 watches and then the $20,000 or $100,000 Rexhepis or whatever. I think it's collapsed a little bit as people just learn more about the industry and learn more about modern watchmaking. And I think just independent watchmaking has flourished so much over the past few years. And a lot of these folks are able to call on some of these vintage or heritage cues that they feel that modern brands aren't as much. And, I think that some of these independents have done a better job of it. And I think vintage collectors have glommed onto that a little bit. And then, I mean, I don't know, modern watch collectors, I probably can't speak as much about if and how they get into the vintage world, but I do feel 10 years ago, maybe even you would have categorized there's vintage collectors and modern collectors. I do think it's just becoming there's watch collectors nowadays, and people are more comfortable going back and forth between the two. Do you see that evolution at all that I'm talking about, or not really? I mean, you've been doing this a lot longer than me.
I see a lot of weird things all over the place. I wouldn't say that you're wrong. I see a lot of exceptions to that rule. I'll tell you something that I noticed, which is pretty firm. While, again, there's probably exceptions out there, I've noticed that people tend to not be interested in the vintage product of a brand as well as the new one. Meaning, if some guy's into vintage Tag Heuer, the chance of him being into vintage Heuer, the fact of him being into modern Tag Heuer are bad. If you're into like old Rolex, you're probably not wearing new Rolex. And so what I found is the people that are into a vintage side of a brand, when they're wearing new, it's some other brand entirely. And I don't know what it is, but for some reason, your average collector can't seem to accept wearing modern stuff from the brand and old stuff. Again, I'll have to look into it more, but it's a trend that I've noticed. So I think that that's one interesting hurdle that I think needs to be overcome. I also think that the independents, as you said, have that discovery element that I think people like with vintage. I think there's been this sort of idea with vintage that you're sort of searching for treasure. The big brands, the sort of corporate brands, they feel sometimes less approachable, less artisanal sometimes, even though that's not always true. And I think with the little brands, while they're not synonymous in any way with vintage, you kind of feel like you're buying art. Like, oh, there's the guy that made it. I want to hear what his life is like. I want to support that artist. He's a nice guy. What a nice lady. What great design she does. I want to get from her. I want to support her. I want to see what she does next. And you never think about that with like a big brand. You're like, oh, I want to support them so I can see what they do next. I think the consumer feels empowered as though their support is helping the industry to move on. Whereas the big brands, Seiko's going to be there whether or not you're buying their watches, right? You don't feel a genuine sense of appreciation. Seiko's not going to send you a handwritten note. Thank you for buying our $1,500 mechanical watch that we make a huge amount of. But like those little guys with that $1,500 watch, you'll get that real appreciation. So I think that there's an increasing variety of things that watch collectors like, but I don't know yet if everyone is sort of pan-spectrum liking everyone. There's very few people I know that are truly into everything. Vintage, little brands, big brands. You know what I mean? Like, it's still too much for the average consumer to wrap their mind around.
100%. I agree with that. I think it is mainly the second thing that I was talking about. People that were into vintage Rolex getting into a modern independent. You don't see them collecting at least modern Rolex. They might have one or two they like in the catalog, but that's about it. And there is it's like that stewardship element. You feel watches or watch collecting should exist, and you feel as though you're being a good steward of like the industry, I think. So you're totally right there.
In 1862, Franz Ludwig Loebner began his career making precision timekeepers in what would become Germany. Settling in Berlin, he received an official clockmaker's mandate from the king and quickly gravitated towards the then pioneering technology of creating precise instruments to measure short durations of time. In 1881, Loebner was already an exclusive mark thanks to their ability to mass-produce chronographs able to measure 1/100th of a second. Just a few years later, they developed a clock
able to measure 1/1000th of a second for sports and scientific purposes. Loebner continued to be a recognized German leader in precise and reliable high-accuracy timekeeping into the 20th century. They were among the first to use highly precise electric switches to trigger their mechanical measuring devices in order to overcome the limitations of human response time. Loebner has now been revived for a modern era. The company continues its long legacy of creating precise and beautiful timing equipment for today's demanding users. The Loebner Steel Racer features a novel chronograph-focused dial with an eccentric reading of the time and a sliding crown guard system. The time-only Loebner Sledge model features a smaller 100-meter water-resistant case and a new inner rotating timing bezel system. Learn more about the history of precision timekeeping instruments and the new Loebner wristwatch collection at lbnr.com.
So your newsletter, Unpolished, I can't see it. It's on Substack. But that's very interesting because, you know, the theme of A Blog to Watch was always make it available to as many people as possible, make it free, just, you know, make it so that Google is going to promote it and people can search for it when they're looking for questions and things like that. Today, when it comes to trying to make money as someone in publishing, there's this other idea of, you know, you have stuff behind a paywall and you have people pay for it, which is great in theory. But tell me, how does that work out in practice? Because, you know, I still think we're a couple of years away from people fully accepting the idea of paying for content. I think searchability is a huge element there. But what's that been like, having something which is behind a wall like that?
Yeah, you're right. So I publish two newsletters a week. One is paid, one is free, and you know, the paid one, I'll leave a portion of it kind of as a teaser to get you in, Ariel. But I think it's a trend I've seen in other industries kind of working. I think people have become more willing to pay for content as they've seen, first of all, just the ad-supported world kind of atrophy. I think if you go on any random website, this is not as much an issue with watch websites, but if you go on a random CNN website, you're just plagued with ads, and you know, it kind of can be a kind of an annoying user experience. But you've seen a lot of these niche publications especially lean into paid subscriptions. So I thought I'd try it out in watches, and it's only been about 6 weeks since I launched, but
that recently.
Yeah. So I had a newsletter way before I worked at Hodinkee. I started a newsletter about 5 years ago. I just thought it would be a good way to, you know, it builds on itself. It's like compound interest, the eighth wonder of the world. And, you know, here I am 5 years later, still leaning into it and kind of turning it into a paid product. So if you look at it, most of the archives are still free, and it's just become paid in the past month and a half. But it's just, I think people are more willing to pay for stuff, Netflix, Spotify, et cetera. Not that I'm comparing myself to them because that's a losing battle, but I think people are more willing to open their wallet to pay for content, support people, however you want to call it. And I think there's just so much out there. There also is like kind of the editorial or curatorial aspect of it all. That's like, I think people kind of enjoy as well. You know, here's 2 newsletters and here's everything I saw in the watches in the watch world this week and my opinion on it. And, you know, hopefully some new fresh stuff as well that you may have not read about elsewhere. So it's going well so far. And I also I like being able to lean on the fact that I draw support from my subscribers, from the community or whatever you want to call it, that's around the newsletter, people that have been following me for 5-6 years at this point. And that's the people around which I'm building my business. You know, I have, instead of having a few advertising clients, I have, you know, hundreds of subscribers. And, you know, this comes with its own challenges as well, of course. But I've enjoyed building the business that way so far. And there's also the reality of like, it would be difficult for me to build an advertising business here in 2025, competing with the aBlogtoWatches and whoever else of the world, right?
I couldn't replicate what we did in 2007 today.
Exactly. So if you've got to do something, like if I were to, you know, if you're going to do a new publication, you kind of just have to launch a different business model and try things differently and have a different value proposition in 2025. So that's kind of what I did, and it's going well so far. I'm happy with it so far, at least.
I think something that's worth mentioning is that the entire watch industry is funded by consumers, right? It's all based upon people buying watches one at a time. That funds everything from the advertising which is spent to, new products and things like that. And what I found interesting is that a lot of consumers feel that by buying watches, they're doing their part to support, quote unquote, the hobby. And they don't necessarily realize that that's not enough. Once brands get money, they don't like to share it again. And they're asked to do more things like buy accessories, maybe pay for events, newsletters, things like that. I think it's a lot to ask the consumer. It's not always easy to do. But my question is, other than watches, what do you find so far? And again, it's a moving target. People are willing to pay for in this hobby.
I think when I launched with a founding membership as well. That's about $300. And there's merch attached to it. You get a valet tray from Veblenist, a local Chicago, maker of straps and stuff here. I think people do like to buy stuff like that to support you. I think there's a class of people that would probably buy more straps from me and will never pay a dime for a newsletter. So I think people do like to support you by buying merch, straps, all those types of accessories that you just mentioned. I think that's a big part of it. I think another big one is, I pay for a couple of different sort of communities basically. And they're mostly digital, right? Like Slacks and Discords and stuff like that in watches. And then other hobbies I'm interested in. And I'll pay $5 a month, honestly, just to be able to engage with those people. So I think that's one. And then I don't know if people are willing to pay for events, but people like to gather in person a ton. I'm not sure what the transaction is there. Maybe they just do have to be brand supported and brands have to be footing the alcohol bill at the end of the day. But people do want to be able to gather in person more. So I think that's another part of it as well. I think those are kind of some of the main pillars that I think about right now.
I've been interviewing a lot of collectors, over the course of what I do. And something that I've asked a couple of people that the response at first shocked me, and then now I'm understanding what it means. And I basically asked people point blank, if it wasn't for this hobby's ability to help you form friendships and maintain them, would you still be in the watch hobby? And my guess at first that people would say, yeah, I do it for the watches. It's really nice to be able to chat with people, but ultimately I like watches. But more often than not, actually, I heard people stop, think about the question, and then say, no, I actually don't think I would continue. Now, that's not to say the watches themselves aren't fun and attractive. There's a lot of people out there that are in it for the watches. I am, and a lot of people are. But there's a more modern manifestation of hobbyist who is doing it for the social element. It's really about friends. Again, as an adult, it's hard to find friends. It's hard to maintain friendships. It's out of a work or school environment, it's almost impossible for an adult man or woman to make friends, right? It's just really, really hard. In this hobby, because you're sort of all thrown in to this confusing amount of information and history and variety, you sort of almost need a group of people there with you to contend with all the information. And then that social element ends up being more interesting than watches because you can't afford watches all day long. That's the funny thing. The brands expect people to buy, I don't know, about 807 watches a year, right? Is that what they seem to expect from us? Just a huge amount of watches. And people can't do that. They buy a new watch whenever they can. It's definitely not in the dozens per year for most people. It's ideally one or two nice watches a year if you can afford that. But they keep going to the events because it's a place to hang out with their buddies, chat with them, catch up, feel a sense of community and togetherness, which in a sense is divorced from the product. It could be some other hobby. If it got them to make friends and keep friends, they would do it. And that's good, but it's also dangerous because the moment doesn't become fun for them and their friends, they're out of it and they're going to move on. And I don't think brands understand that. I think brands just continue to raise prices and lean on the consumer so hard that they're almost ensuring they annoy enough people to go away, because I think that brands are decreasingly understanding why consumers, not all, but many consumers are in this hobby to begin with.
Yeah, some of the brands that are doing the best right now, I mean, some of these high-end brands like Journe and MB&F have done quite a good job of cultivating a community with their clients, right? And you can, when you're selling a few hundred watches a year, you can literally know every single client. But one of the things it changed for a few years, I think, during the pandemic especially, but I was really attracted to not only the analog nature of watches themselves, but just the hobby itself. It started with forums and it was slow moving. And I talked about my interest in vintage watches and all of that type of stuff, but it felt very divorced at one point from the hustle and bustle of modern living, right? That changed. I think it got caught up in everything else in 2021 and 2022, but I think it's dissipated a little bit, and it's gone back to feeling a little bit more like this nice analog hobby where there's not a lot of people were acquiring a lot of stuff just constantly in those early years, 2020 to 2022. And that's not as much the case anymore. We're not being terrible influences on each other as much. We're just checking in with each other. Hey, are you going to the boutique events at this brand tonight or whatever? This is locally at least, right? Or are you going to be at this meetup, whatever it is? And I think it's become healthier again, which is it's become more enjoyable again for me, at least. I was a little burned out and exhausted by it for a little bit because it felt like everything else in the world where it was just go, 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 and prices were going up 10% every day. And it's like, when the hell am I going to be able to buy a watch, right? And it feels more like that analog hobby that I really came to enjoy before those few years of craziness.
I'll explain the reason that what I think initially attracted me to become a hobbyist, not just to like watches, but to follow the watch industry. And I wonder how much this is interesting to other people or even how relevant this is today. I got into it because, especially in the early 2000s, there was an enormous amount of new stuff coming out. Totally new designs, new brands when it really wasn't common for there to be totally new brands. The independents, especially the high-end ones, were just getting started, and they didn't have the marketing budgets, but they could make wild things. There was a lot of technology trying to go into watches. Computer-aided design and manufacturing was really starting to make a big impact. And therefore, there's a lot of types of components that were never able to be made before and materials. And what excited me was waiting to see what was next. It was kind of in the way that someone that grows up in pop culture wants, what's the next cool movie, right? What's the next cool TV show or song or artist that comes out? And I liked watches for the ability of the product, not just to be something I wanted to wear or buy, but be something that I was curious at how it was made. I was curious that it existed. It was intellectually and artistically fascinating to me. And I think that still is a bit of a rarity today. I think people, when new products come out, are not necessarily comfortable forming their own opinion. They're like, oh, Tony knows more than me. What does he think about this? I'm not necessarily able to come to a conclusion. And if it wasn't for that steady stream of new stuff, I think that I would lose interest, because by virtue of what I do, I can't just go to those groups and be buddies with the guys because I work in the industry. I'm like a media personality, you know what I mean? Like I have to have a certain wall up and things like that. So I've never been able to enjoy that level, but I still enjoy it from the level of, hey, watch industry, surprise me, because I like that.
Yeah, I get that. I think, do you ever worry that we go too far in the other direction? I think about fashion, for example. I know there's a lot of conversation about, man, there are too many fashion shows. There's like, this week and this week, there's Paris and London and New York and back to back to back and multiple seasons, multiple times a year. I worry if watches go too far in that direction. I don't think they have, to be clear. I mean, there's Watches and Wonders. There's one big trade show a year. That said, some watch brands have gone to more of a basically year-round calendar release schedule where we see something from a brand in January, again in March, et cetera, et cetera. And I think I worry more about that going too far in the other direction of like just too much of a cadence of too many releases versus too slow of a cadence. Do you worry about that at all?
I'm very cognizant there's a lot of change happening in the industry, constant evolution in an industry that likes stability, that likes doing the same thing, that likes predictability, yet they're faced with a world that has a lot of things changing. So I guess I'm less afraid because I'm not expecting anything to stay the same. I'm expecting for there to be wins and losses. I'm expecting for there to be disappointments. I'm expecting for brands we know and love to die. I'm expecting for new brands to form that we didn't know we liked, but we end up liking. I feel confident that today and tomorrow people will like watches, that tomorrow watches will continue to be made, and that eventually the market helps even things out. If watches are too expensive for a while, then that industry will implode, because we know that it doesn't actually cost that much money today to make a great watch. Even in low production numbers, for just a few $1,000s, you can get a very satisfying item. A lot of watches that cost $1 million, you try to determine actually what they cost to be made, and it's like, I don't know, 50 grand. And I'm not talking about not including research and development, things like that. Like, that does include a lot of that. So knowing that there's this huge desire to profit and get margins, that's fragile. That's always fragile, right? The most competitive industries are those that know how to make things at a higher volume and actually get less margin because they're trying to be more competitive. And this is and will continue to be a highly competitive space. So brands that try to insulate themselves and act as though they're not part of the industry, like Audemars Piguet in a lot of ways over the last couple of years, they're like, oh, no, we're not part of the watch industry. We're our own thing. Don't compare us with those other products or prices because we're a different kind of brand, which is, a bunch of smoke and mirrors. So at some point, I think that strategy will implode because you pull the veil away and consumers are like, wait a minute, you don't actually have something that special. But if wearing that AP still gets you into the right clubs and gets you the lady and gets you the wink and the smile, people will continue to spend a lot of money on it. So I'm cognizant of the inherent fragility. It doesn't bother me. I'm just not having my heart set on any part of this industry staying the same.
Yeah, I think that's well said. I mean, there's so much has been in flux the past few years, and a new brand or a new watchmaker comes on the scene almost every day. And I mean, almost part of the thing is like, you kind of have to have a different business model often. And it's, it kind of has to be orthogonal to these heritage brands. And, whether it's going to direct to consumer and not doing retailers, whatever it is. But like, part of that is putting on full display, like what the costs are, some of these brands that are, kind of part of their pitch is like, we mark it up 3x basically, right? It puts it on display for all to see. And there are, risks with that model as well, but it's put a lot on display the last few years, especially. And, look, I love a lot of these heritage brands and I hope that many of them are able to adapt and continue to survive, but it's not easy. But the competition is a good thing for consumers. I mean, I get excited about so many of these small brands that have come about in the past, 10, 15 years. That's where a lot of the excitement is right now.
In the vintage world, especially, I think that one of the issues that has concerned me, you're talking about things that concern you, that concerns me, is going back to this idea of pricing. And the fragility that worries me is that when something costs so much, you have such a narrow amount of people that are into it that the moment they like something else, you're gone, right? Let's say, you're talking about Journe or something like that. They've convinced a few hundred people that their watches are awesome, buy them, blah, blah, blah. But if they start to lose some of those people, what does it take to get someone new into that group? It's hard. You have to tell the whole brand story all over again. You have to get them into it. It's not that compelling if you're not already drinking the Kool-Aid. And to get you drinking the Kool-Aid means you have to do the story all over again. And I don't see that those types of brands that have now developed those good relations with the small groups trying to cast their net any bigger. So a lot of these communities are inherently fragile because they're like, oh, we have our small group that's into us and willing to pay for it. Okay, what happens when you lose them? To get new people is going to be extremely expensive and hard. And everyone fresh to the hobby is going to be like, I don't care that you were hot for a while. You're not competitive. And I think a very good example is Frank Mueller. Frank Mueller in the 1990s was the hot independent, right? They made an enormous variety of stuff, crazy parties, cool stuff. Prices started to go up. They started to get a little full of themselves, weren't really paying to the competition. And then I'm not saying they're impressive today, but I don't really know that they're on the radar of a lot of collectors. They haven't gone ahead and done anything to recapture that group for a very, very, very long time. And so I don't think it's enough just to have a super expensive product anymore. I think that a lot of these heritage brands, as you call them, don't recognize that it doesn't stop with product. And it doesn't end with manipulation either. You have to have a compelling product, brand, marketing, service, all of that all the time, especially for the novices. And they always talk about, oh, the young buyer, the young buyer. They don't even mean the young buyer. They mean the new buyer. That's what they mean. They mean someone who hasn't already been indoctrinated. I want new blood. I want people that have a fresh mind so I can twist and mold them to how I want them to be. That for me is increasingly expensive. And that's why I worry that a lot of the heritage brands are not prepared to do what it takes to develop new clients.
Yeah. I mean, it's still difficult for the ones that are hot, right? Like if I, youngish person, wanted to become a new client of a lot of these brands, Journe, AP, whatever, like how would I even go about doing that? You walk in a store, first of all, there's nothing there to even try on. So I'm not even convinced that I even like the watch. And then I'm basically told to F off because, the waiting list is 5 years and you got to buy all this other stuff first that I don't want. Like,
So
these are the problems that are inherent in the industry, obviously. But the bigger issue, right? I mean, we talked about it at the top, is the kind of premiumization of watches and some of these brands has left a potential gap, or a potential on-ramp has been kind of pulled out from the industry, in the sense that there's no way for someone to get on board. I mean, the classic thing is like, this is kind of part of the group model where you get onboarded with Baume and Mercier, and then you buy a Jaeger-LeCoultre, and then you're buying a Lange and Sona, and that's kind of how it goes, or that's the theory at least. And I worry that some of the premiumization of the industry has taken away some of that on-ramp for a younger generation of consumers. And to your point, I mean, it's happened in the vintage world as well. Like, prices have gotten so crazy. You kind of have to look. You have to look under certain rocks or in certain corners to find things that are appealing to you and also accessibly priced. Like, the days of buying a vintage sub for a couple $1,000 are obviously long gone. So I do worry about it. I think it's an industry problem too, not just a Journe or an AP or whatever. Name your high end brand problem.
Are these topics the type of things you talk about in your newsletters? I'm just curious what you're helping your readers to navigate, because I think that's the value that we have, right? Is we're helping people sort through too much information, too many options. What do you help your readers with?
Yeah, I try to address some of these things. I also try to be pretty specific about it. I mean, when you get into it with collectors, new or vintage, vintage collectors are very detail oriented, right? Like, are the hands reloomed or not? Is this the original crown, original pushers, all of that type of stuff. So trying to be very specific about, if I'm talking about a certain watch, getting really into the details. And then I'll zoom out and talk about what it might mean for the industry or the market more broadly, that this watch sold for that much, or whatever the example might be in this case. But I do try to be like pretty specific in giving specific guidance or specific takeaways, while also, talking about a lot of these things. I wrote an article recently about, kind of some of the stuff you're talking about, the ways in which you can get a hot indie, some of these indies that seem like they only go allocated to these Instagram famous collectors or people in media, like talking to people I know that have acquired these watches that are just guys, that they're not on Instagram, and explaining what the allocation process was like for people that might want to acquire these watches. They're just collectors. They're not, industry voices or well-known kind of influencery types, but sort of very specific, like, things that can help you in your collecting journey, whatever it is, I think is kind of part of what I think about trying to do.
I think the bigger topic here is an issue that the industry is contending with, that we're sort of talking about, and that has two parts. One, it is, how do you create the desire for these products? And then how do you fulfill the demand that desire creates? And these are two separate things that can be tricky. And it really stems down to is, how do you make somebody want this, your expensive product in a sea of expensive products? And then once they want it, what's the right way of getting them to buy it so that they, in fact, buy it? And so you pointed out a very interesting issue where there's a lot of brands that are good on the demand side. They make people want them, yet they have failed to create a way for people to actually fulfill that desire. So you might want that Journe, but you don't end up spending your money on them because someone else is ready to take your money now. And I think that's part of the problem with this, we're so hot, you need to wait for us, is that there's plenty of other brands that are hot because they have good products and are willing to take your money now, and it will make you feel real good about it. And I have said, and I'd love your thoughts on this, is that there's no worse thing in the watch collecting hobby than spending your money on a watch and then feeling like whoever you bought it from doesn't appreciate your money. People want to feel that who they're buying from, especially if it's a new product or expensive thing, makes them feel happy. And that's why the service and the sitting down and the champagne and the anniversary cards, the little gifts, it's all about making people feel that their dollars are worth it. And Rolex had a huge problem with this because for several years, it's ending now, people felt horrible trying to buy one and said, this company doesn't want my money. They make me feel like crap. I'm here to celebrate myself. You won't even let me celebrate myself with thousands of dollars. Screw you. I'm going to go buy a Harley Davidson. And that's what a lot of people did.
That's right. I mean, that is kind of the unseen, or we'll never know the answer to this, right? When we had sort of the supply problem side of this for a couple of years, people that walked into the Rolex boutique and didn't even see any watches there and said, what the hell? And went down to whatever other store that you're kind of talking about. We'll never know what that missed opportunity was. I mean, a couple of these brands, to their credit, I think Rolex is probably the most notable, that kind of is building a new production facility and really expanding their production capabilities to meet that demand. So I think that's good. I think of it, maybe we're saying different things, but saying the same thing in slightly different words. I just always want to feel like wherever I'm spending my money is they're kind of earning it, right? Like this can be in giving me bringing out the nice leather tray with the watch and, folding out the tissue paper and the champagne. But I get just as much sort of joy or feeling that they've earned it if I'm shipped a watch via FedEx, but I have met the guy behind the micro brand and I know like what went into the design process and I've talked to him at a watch fair or whatever it might be. I just want the feeling that they've actually like worked for their dollars and earned it. And I think there was a feeling for a while that some of these brands especially could do no wrong, right? They already had the demand there and they didn't have to work for their money, right? But the reality is it's very, very difficult to sell a watch. And the industry forgot that for a couple of years. And we've been kind of coldly reminded of that over the past 2 years. And this goes not just for brands, it goes for media and PR firms. It's everyone, right? Like we kind of forget when times are easy, that it's like not actually easy to sell a watch that no one needs.
So on this note, I want you to give some advice on this topic. As we know, the world economy is mostly focusing on the United States when it comes to luxury sales. That's not new, that's known. Growth in China has ended. It's a very difficult market there now. So the consumers that brands will have to convince are in large part in the United States. And the United States is a mature consumer market. Many people are familiar with luxury. Maybe they don't know all the brands, but they understand luxury products and marketing, things like that. So what advice can you give brands who now have to redouble their efforts and focus on the United States, who have to go ahead and convince people, but maybe coming from a point of not really knowing what to do? What are some best and worst practices of dealing with consumers in the United States and creating demand?
Yeah, I'd like you to answer this question too, actually. This is good. Maybe we can focus group it a little bit. But man, I don't know. I still feel like a lot of times, like these watch brands, if you just walk into a boutique, I mean, I work in the industry. I've worked in the industry for a bit now. You much longer than me. I walk by a boutique and I have to like take a deep breath, like before I walk in the door still. Like it's nerve-wracking. Everyone's wearing a suit there. Like, it feels as though they're actively not trying to sell you a watch a lot of times. I mean, you'll kind of become friendly with a sales associate there, and they'll have the brand story and all that type of stuff. But I just think to myself, man, it really feels like you're trying to scare people away, which kind of sucks. Like, and I'm in this, and I know a lot about watches and all that. Like, I'm qualified to walk in a boutique, I guess. Not that even anyone should have to feel like that, but that's just kind of the retail experience of it all. And that, that doesn't even get to the digital part of it, the part that you and I probably think about more often. But I think there's probably still a lot of adaptation to do there as well in terms of communication and PR. And I'm not sure. Some brands have done a better job of it, of being getting the balance between feeling accessible, but also exclusive. Like, I think the balance is still out of whack for most brands. I mean, you want to be an accessible aspiration, I guess, is kind of what I think. And I think a lot of these brands are just, I don't know. I think they feel more exclusive than anything, and I don't necessarily mean that in a positive connotation. But I think I don't even know if that's U.S. specific. I think more broadly than that, though, I think people in the U.S. are exhausted for the most part, not only with luxury, not only with consuming things, but just more broadly, politically, the economy, whatever else. And I think a good watch brand is going to figure out ways to communicate that their product is an escape from that exhaustion, whether it's the analog nature of it, the craftsmanship of it, the nostalgia of it, whatever it might be. I think if you can communicate your watch as an escape from the exhaustion of modern life, especially nowadays in America, you might have success. Anything I say resonate with you?
Well, I'm hearing some interesting things, and most notably, you're advising the industry to be a good hobby. It's be the best hobby you can be. People need hobbies. Be a good hobby. Be an approachable hobby. Be one that allows people to feel good. I don't know that there's any hope for a lot of those stores. I've never liked going into most watch stores. The only ones I've ever felt comfortable in are, I guess what you call family-owned, multi-brand retailers that are they just want you to come in. They want to show you stuff. They've always got a lot of people in there. It's just sort of an inviting environment. You don't really feel like there's any one agenda. They just want to show off, and it's a celebratory environment. They're like, come in here and enjoy this thing that we like as well. I've never one time been into a brand boutique that's like a mono brand boutique and had anywhere near that experience. I mean, a lot of the times the auspices of me going in there are like, I'm not just some random person. I'm like, I have a meeting. It's like they know who I am. You know what I mean? I very rarely go in as sort of just an average consumer because it's never been good back years ago to today. But again, the multi-brand environment is by far the environment that I prefer, at least from a consumer comfort perspective. And I think that what I think brands need to understand, as you said, is that people are not necessarily looking to feel worse about themselves, which is really a strategy that worked well. I mean, I hate to say this, but a lot of watch brands' core strategy is how do we make really rich people feel extremely insecure? Because they have found a long time ago that when you say no to someone who is not accustomed to hearing no, they're like, don't say no to me. I'm used to getting yes. I'll pay double. I'll pay triple. Just say yes to me. And like, I mean, I don't want to sort of put it in one big category, but like that was really the Richard Mille kind of, focus on for a long time. That's what they did. That's how they became hot, is they were really good at saying no to people that weren't used to having the word no said to them. Ferrari, another very good example. And that's easy. Once you do that a few times, you're like, wait a minute, all I have to do is just treat them like everyone else and I'll get more money. That becomes sort of addictive. But that is not a mainstream element. You can't do that with most people because most consumers are like, screw you, man. And most rich people at some point are like, wait a minute, screw me once or twice, okay. But eventually I'm going to be like, dude, I've had enough of this game. And the thing that I would add is, several years ago, maybe more than several years ago, decades ago, it was easy enough for the watch industry, especially in the United States, to associate with a lifestyle, go into the car events, go into the fashion shows and things like that. And therefore, you could sort of be part of luxury because you're already participating in luxury events. These days, there's a lot less of those organic opportunities. So what brands need to do is not only ride along the coattails of the lifestyle, but create the lifestyle. If you want to create a nice celebratory event where people can go and appreciate heritage in your brand and whatever, you've got to make it. You've got to create those experiences which allow people to feel the right way, to be open-minded to getting a positive experience from your brand, maybe forming the desire to get you. You can't just be like, oh, we have a tuxedo watch for all those instances you're wearing tuxedos. Well, no one's wearing tuxedos very, very often. If the brand wants the tuxedo watch, they got to give you an opportunity to come wearing a tuxedo. That's kind of the responsibility of a lot of the brands, especially the heritage ones. Because the reality for most consumers these days is they're not going to these types of parties. In fact, most people aren't even wearing suits. So you have to remind people why somebody in the past would have worn this watch. Who is this for? You have to spend a lot less time imagining that the consumer already knows what to do with you.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, you have to build, I don't want to say a whole world around your product, but you do have to build something around your product. Yeah, you have to build more around your product than just the product.
Disneyland, Rolex land.
That's right. That's right. God, fingers crossed.
What are you going to do next with your newsletter specifically? We sort of run out of time. We'll have to chat more. But what's interesting to me is, you have this broad ability to do sort of whatever you want and a very diverse pool of opinions out there, whether it's writing, whether it's Instagram, whether it's somebody on YouTube. How do you add a fresh perspective in an increasingly crowded space?
It is, a lot of it's focusing on the vintage market, I think, but for the brand itself or for Unpolished itself, it's focusing on the newsletter for at least the next few months through Watches and Wonders in the early summer. But you've got to do everything. It's kind of like these brands. You've got to do video and podcasts and social and build a whole, you got to take a studio or a portfolio approach to it. The way all of these other, the way every other publication has done it, I think it's just the things that you prioritize have changed a little bit. I don't think as much about the website experience, for example. I think about people coming into it through a newsletter and then maybe adding on YouTube videos that are a take on that newsletter, and how I condense those into bite-sized Instagram reels that'll get people in the door as well. And I was doing the podcast at Hodinkee, and as I said, I really enjoyed talking to people and getting more perspectives than just mine. So not only interviewing people and collectors, but also getting contributors on board so that it's not just me that you're hearing from all the time, because I have opinions, but I only have so many, and I only have so much time in the day. So, getting more diverse perspectives. And I think that's kind of, I'm focused on the newsletter for at least the foreseeable future, but sort of video will come next. And then after that, figuring out a way to do podcasting. And along the way, I've already got one contributor that's helping me with various aspects of the newsletter, but kind of figuring out other voices that I can kind of hopefully prop up in a modern way.
Next time we chat, you'll have to share more of your opinions because I'm curious about them. But before we end, tell people where they can learn more about you or find your content on the internet.
Yeah, sure. First of all, thanks for having me on, Ariel. Just find me Tony_Traina on Instagram. More importantly, follow me at unpolishedwatches.com. Subscribe to the newsletter. It is, you can subscribe for free. You don't have to hand over the credit card. You'll get at least a newsletter and a half a week, or it's $100 a year, $10 a month. So that's where you can find me.
Thank you, Tony. This has been the Superlative Podcast interview with Tony Traina. Thank you so much.